The night he picked it up, everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, like a door slamming open in a house that had been sealed shut for years. Marcus Chen was a man who had learned to live without hope, without purpose, without feeling anything at all. He had become a ghost in his own life, invisible even to himself. But on one ordinary evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a tiny, broken creature would collapse at his feet and force him to make a choice that would shatter every wall he'd built around his heart. This is the story of how one moment of compassion resurrected a dead man. Marcus Chen lived in a house that wasn't really a home anymore. It was just a place where a broken man went to wait for time to pass. The walls were the color of forgetting, beige, neutral, designed to make you feel nothing. And that was exactly the point. He had perfected the art of disappearing, not physically, but in every way that mattered. He woke up at the same time every morning, 6:15 a.m. Without fail, his body clock so attuned to routine that he no longer needed an alarm. He made the same coffee in the same chipped mug that he'd owned for 3 years. He sat on the same porch in the same weathered rocking chair that creaked in a familiar rhythm. He watched the same trees sway in the wind, their branches moving in patterns he had memorized so completely that he could predict their movements before they happened. And then he went to bed at precisely 10 p.m., only to repeat it all again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, stretching into an infinite succession of identical days that blurred together into one long, gray continuum of existence without living. This was his life now, a loop of numbness so complete, so total, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to actually be alive. Not in the philosophical sense, not in some poetic metaphor about the human condition, but in the literal, physical, visceral sense of feeling something. Anything. Joy, pain, anger, fear, hope. All of it had been gradually erased from his internal landscape until there was nothing left but a vast, empty plain of emotional flatness. But here's the thing about rock bottom. You don't always recognize it when you're standing on it. In fact, most people never realize they've reached it until they're already so far down that climbing back up seems impossible. Marcus had passed that point long ago. Marcus had lost everything that mattered. His career, destroyed by a single catastrophic mistake that cost his company $47 million and shattered the trust of everyone around him. He had been the VP of operations at Meridian Technologies, a mid-sized software firm that had been on the verge of going public. For 15 years, he had built that company from the ground up, pouring his blood and sweat and tears into every decision, every strategy, every long night spent in the office until the cleaning crew came through. He had been respected. He had been admired. He had been someone. And then came the audit. A simple mistake, a misallocated fund that should have been caught by the accounting department but wasn't. A miscommunication between teams that resulted in a $47 million discrepancy that went unnoticed for 6 months. And when it was finally discovered, the fallout was catastrophic. The SEC got involved. The board of directors turned on him like a pack of wolves. The media descended with their cameras and their questions and their hunger for a scandal. Within 2 weeks, he was fired. Within a month, he was facing potential criminal charges. Within 3 months, those charges were dropped due to lack of evidence that he had acted with intent. But the damage was already done. His marriage dissolved in the aftermath, his wife unable to look at him without seeing the failure he had become. Sarah had stood by him for the first few weeks, believing in his innocence, supporting him through the initial shock and chaos. But as the reality of their situation began to sink in, the legal bills, the loss of income, the social ostracism. Something shifted in her eyes. She stopped believing in him. More than that, she stopped seeing him as the man she had married. She saw a liability, a mistake, a weight dragging her down. They tried therapy. They tried to talk it through. But there was no recovering from that fundamental loss of trust. After 16 years of marriage, she filed for divorce. The settlement was generous. She didn't want to destroy him completely, just remove herself from the wreckage. But it was the kindness of it that hurt the most, because it meant she had already written him off. She was simply being humane to a man she no longer believed had any future. His reputation, obliterated so completely that he couldn't walk into a grocery store without feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. The story had made the local news. Meridian Technologies VP faces scrutiny over accounting discrepancy. He wasn't named in the headlines, but everyone knew. His friends from college didn't return his calls. His parents, who had been so proud of his success, stopped mentioning him to their friends. LinkedIn connections that he had spent years cultivating suddenly disappeared from his network. The professional world had a long memory, and that memory was merciless. And worst of all, he had lost himself. The man he used to be. Ambitious, driven, full of possibility. The kind of person who believed that hard work and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. That man had died the day the scandal broke. Marcus could pinpoint the exact moment. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March. He was in the CEO's office, and the CEO was telling him that the board had voted unanimously to terminate his employment effective immediately. Marcus had felt something inside him shatter in that moment, like a pane of glass struck by a stone. And in the months that followed, he had slowly come to understand that the man he had been was gone. Not temporarily, not recoverable, but completely and permanently erased, replaced by something hollow and broken. The man who remained was just a shell, going through the motions of existing without any genuine reason to exist at all. He had no friends left, not because they had explicitly abandoned him, but because he had withdrawn from every relationship until there was nothing left to maintain. He had no family who would take his calls. His parents had died 5 years before the scandal, and his sister lived on the West Coast and had her own life to worry about. He had no prospects, no job offers, no recruiters knocking on his door, no future that he could envision or plan for. Just an endless present that stretched out before him like a desert with no horizon. A vast emptiness that seemed to expand with each passing day. People who have never hit rock bottom don't understand what it's like. They think it's dramatic. They think it's a moment of crisis followed by a moment of clarity, like something out of a movie where the protagonist hits their lowest point and then miraculously transforms into a better version of themselves. But the truth is far more terrifying. Rock bottom is quiet. It's lonely. It's the slow, grinding realization that you have become completely and utterly irrelevant to the world around you. It's the understanding that no one is waiting for you to recover. No one is rooting for you to make a comeback. No one, in fact, is thinking about you at all. Marcus had become so invisible that he sometimes wondered if he still existed at all. There were days when he would go through his entire routine. Wake up, make coffee, sit on the porch, watch the sunset, go to bed, without speaking a single word out loud. He would go weeks without having a conversation with another human being. His groceries were delivered. His utilities were paid automatically. He had no reason to interact with anyone. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, he had begun to feel like a ghost, present in the physical world, but somehow removed from it, observing life from behind a thick pane of glass that prevented him from truly connecting with anything or anyone. He had developed routines to fill the void, though fill wasn't really the right word. It was more like he had created a structure to contain the emptiness, to give it shape and form so that it wouldn't consume him completely. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., without exception, he would make his coffee. Black, no sugar, because what did it matter if it tasted good? Taste was just another sensation that required him to feel something. And he had worked too hard to achieve this state of numbness, to risk it by introducing pleasure into his day. Every afternoon at 2 p.m., he would take a walk around his property, not because he enjoyed it or needed the exercise, but because the doctor, the last doctor he had seen 3 years ago, had warned him that complete inactivity would kill him faster than anything else. So he walked. He walked the same path around his 5 acres, past the same trees, past the same fence line, past the same creek that ran through the back of his property. The walk took exactly 47 minutes, and he had timed it so many times that he could do it in his sleep. And every evening at sunset, without fail, he would sit on his porch and watch the sky change colors, as if watching the day die was the only thing that made sense anymore. There was something about that moment. The transition from day to night, the slow fade of light, the inevitable descent into darkness, that felt appropriate. It felt like the only honest thing left in his life. The sun didn't pretend to keep shining when its time was over. It didn't struggle against the darkness. It simply accepted its fate and disappeared. Marcus found that comforting. His house sat on 5 acres of land, far enough from civilization that he rarely saw another human being. This was intentional. He had chosen isolation not because he wanted to be alone, but because he couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing what he had become. The shame was too heavy. The failure was too complete. It was easier to disappear entirely than to face the pity in people's eyes, or worse, the judgment. He had read enough articles online to know what people thought of him. A cautionary tale, a man who had it all and threw it away through carelessness or incompetence or both. He didn't want to see that reflected back at him in real time. The property had been a good investment, or at least it had been at the time of purchase. He had bought it 5 years ago, during the first few years after the scandal, when the money was still flowing, and he still harbored some vague hope that he might rebuild his life in a new location, away from the judgment and the memories. The house was a modest ranch-style home with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. He used 1 bedroom for sleeping, 1 as an office that he never went into, and the 3rd was simply closed off. He had no use for it. The kitchen was functional, but rarely used. He ate simply, usually just whatever he could prepare without much effort. Frozen dinners, canned soup, the occasional attempt at cooking that usually ended in failure and frustration. The money had lasted longer than he expected, though it was running out now. His severance package from Meridian, combined with the settlement from the divorce and some careful budgeting, had been enough to buy this property and live modestly for years. But even that was finite. In another year, maybe 18 months, the money would be gone. And then he would need to figure out what came next. He would need to get a job, or apply for some kind of assistance, or do something to keep himself fed and housed. And the thought of that terrified him, more than anything else. Not because he was afraid of being poor, though that was certainly part of it, but because it meant he would have to re-enter the world. He would have to interact with people. He would have to fill out job applications and go to interviews and pretend that his life had some kind of meaning or purpose. He would have to explain the gap in his employment, the years of absence from the professional world. He would have to face questions and skepticism and the inevitable discovery of his past. He wasn't sure he had it in him. Some nights, lying in bed in the darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence, Marcus would think about how easy it would be to simply stop. To stop waking up at 6:15 a.m., to stop making coffee, to stop taking his walks, to stop watching the sunset, to just stop. He never acted on these thoughts. He wasn't actively suicidal in any way that would require intervention or concern. He had never researched methods or made plans. But they were there, hovering at the edges of his consciousness like a door he could walk through whenever he decided he was ready. And honestly, he was starting to think he might be ready soon. Not today, not tomorrow. But eventually, when the money ran out, when he had to face the world again, when the weight of his own irrelevance became too much to bear. The loneliness had become so complete that it had transformed into something almost peaceful. He had stopped expecting anything from life. He had stopped hoping for redemption or second chances or any kind of meaningful change. He had accepted that this was his fate, to live out his remaining years in quiet obscurity, paying the price for his failure through a slow, grinding erasure of everything that made him human. This was his penance. This was his punishment. And he had made peace with it. This was who Marcus Chen had become, a man with nothing left to lose because he had already lost everything that mattered. A man who was waiting for his life to end, not with drama or violence, but simply through the slow passage of time and the gradual fading of whatever spark of humanity he had left. But that evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, something was about to happen that would shatter his carefully constructed emptiness in ways he could never have anticipated. Something that would force him to feel again. Something that would demand that he choose between the comfortable numbness he had cultivated and the terrifying possibility of actually being alive. The night he picked it up, everything was about to change. The evening was unremarkable in every way. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. Marcus sat in his rocking chair on the porch, coffee gone cold in his mug hours ago, watching the light fade with the detached interest of someone observing a phenomenon that had nothing to do with them. He had done this thousands of times before. He would do it thousands of times again. Or so he thought. The sound came just as the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was faint at first, so faint that Marcus almost didn't register it. But something in his subconscious mind recognized it as wrong, as out of place in the carefully ordered silence of his property. He straightened slightly in his chair, tilting his head, listening. There it was again, a whimper, thin and weak, almost like the cry of a child, but not quite. Something else, something animal. Marcus frowned. In the 5 years he had lived here, he had rarely encountered wildlife on his property. The occasional deer would wander through, but they were silent, graceful creatures that left no trace of their passing. He had heard coyotes in the distance on winter nights, their calls echoing across the landscape like something from another world. But this sound was different. This sound was close, and more importantly, it was a sound of distress. He told himself to ignore it. Whatever it wasn't his problem. His life was built on the principle of non-interference, of maintaining the boundaries that kept him isolated from the world and its complications. Getting involved meant feeling something. Feeling something meant breaking the careful equilibrium he had constructed. But the sound came again, and this time It was unmistakably a cry for help. Marcus rose from his chair slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. He was 53 years old, and his body moved like that of a much older man. Stiff, reluctant, as if it too had given up on the prospect of meaningful action. He descended the porch steps carefully, moving toward the sound. The property was growing darker by the minute, the sun now barely visible above the tree line, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and crimson. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then another whimper, coming from somewhere near the tree line at the edge of his property. Marcus moved in that direction, his eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. He should have gone inside and turned on the floodlights. He should have grabbed a flashlight. But he didn't. Something was pulling him forward, some instinct that he thought had died years ago, some small voice in the back of his mind that was insisting he investigate. As he got closer to the trees, he saw it. At first, he couldn't quite make out what it was. Just a dark shape on the ground, motionless except for the occasional tremor that ran through it. But as his eyes adjusted and he moved closer, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakable. A dog. It was small, at maybe 30 pounds, he guessed, and appeared to be some kind of mixed breed. Even in the dim light, Marcus could see that it was in bad shape. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was blood matted into its fur. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, and it whimpered again when it sensed Marcus's approach. But it didn't try to move or run away. Marcus knelt down beside the animal, his knees cracking with the effort. He had never been particularly good with animals. He had never owned a pet. But looking at this creature, broken and bleeding and clearly in pain, he felt something shift inside him. It was small. It was barely perceptible. But it was there. "It's okay," he said softly, extending his hand slowly so the dog could smell it. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's tail twitched slightly, and it lifted its head just enough to look at him with eyes that were clouded with pain and fear. Those eyes held an intelligence that surprised Marcus. There was awareness there. There was a consciousness looking back at him, asking a question: "Are you going to help me, or are you going to leave me here to die?" Marcus made a decision. He carefully lifted the dog, trying to support its injured leg as gently as possible. The animal whimpered and trembled, but didn't struggle or try to bite. It was too weak, too far gone for that. Marcus carried it back toward the house, moving slowly and carefully, trying not to jar the injured leg any more than necessary. Once inside, he laid the dog on the kitchen table. He would worry about cleaning it later, and turned on all the lights. Now he could see the full extent of the animal's injuries. The hind leg was definitely broken, the bone visible through a tear in the skin. There was a gash along its side that looked like it might have been caused by a car or some other vehicle. Its fur was matted with blood and dirt and things he didn't want to identify. Its ribs were visible, suggesting that it hadn't eaten in days. How long had it been lying out there? How had it gotten to his property? Marcus realized he had no idea what to do. He didn't have a phone number for a veterinarian. He hadn't needed one in years. He didn't have medical supplies beyond basic first aid for humans. He didn't have any dog food or water bowls or any of the basic necessities that a dog would require. But he had Google. He pulled out his laptop, which he rarely used except to pay bills online and occasionally check email, and searched for emergency veterinary clinics in the area. There was one about 20 minutes away in the nearest town. He called the number, and a tired-sounding woman answered on the third ring. "Emergency veterinary clinic. How can I help you?" "I found a dog," Marcus said, surprised to hear his own voice after so long without speaking to another person. It's badly injured. Broken leg, lacerations. Looks like it's been hit by a car or something. Can you help it? There was a pause. Is the dog conscious? Yes. It's alert. It's breathing, but it seems to be in a lot of pain. Bring it in immediately. We'll do what we can, but I can't promise anything until we examine it. How far away are you? About 20 minutes. Come directly. We're open until midnight for emergencies. Marcus hung up and looked at the dog, which was watching him with those same intelligent eyes. We're going to get you help, he said. You're going to be okay. He had no idea if that was true, but saying it felt like the right thing to do. He gathered some old blankets from the linen closet and carefully wrapped the dog in them, trying to immobilize the injured leg as much as possible. Then he carried it out to his car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that he rarely drove, and gently placed it on the back seat. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, Marcus realized something. He was doing something. He was taking action. He was engaging with the world in a way he hadn't done in years. And more than that, he was doing it for someone else. Not for himself. Not for his own benefit or advancement or any kind of personal gain, but simply because a living creature needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. It was a strange feeling. Unfamiliar. Almost frightening in its intensity. He pulled out of his driveway and headed toward town, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror to check on the dog. The animal was still conscious, still watching him, and Marcus found himself speaking to it as he drove. I don't know what your story is, he said. I don't know where you came from or how you ended up on my property, but you're going to make it through this. We're going to make sure of it. The words felt important. They felt like a promise. And for the first time in years, Marcus Chen felt like he had a reason to keep that promise. The night he picked it up, everything changed, not gradually, but instantly. Like a door opening in a house that had been sealed shut for far too long. The emergency veterinary clinic was a small, modern building on the outskirts of town, with bright fluorescent lights spilling out onto the parking lot. Marcus pulled up to the entrance and sat for a moment, engine still running, staring at the glass doors. He hadn't been inside a medical facility of any kind in 3 years. The thought of walking in there, of interacting with people, of having to explain himself and answer questions, made his chest tighten with anxiety. But in the back seat, the dog whimpered softly, and Marcus forced himself to move. He carefully gathered the blanket-wrapped dog in his arms and pushed through the glass doors. The waiting room was small and sterile, with uncomfortable-looking plastic chairs arranged against the walls and a reception desk staffed by a young woman with tired eyes and purple scrubs. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of antiseptic and animal fear and something else he couldn't quite identify. It was overwhelming after so long in the isolation of his property. I called about 20 minutes ago, Marcus said, approaching the desk. I have a dog. It's injured. The receptionist looked up from her computer, and Marcus saw her eyes take in his appearance, the wrinkled clothes, the unkempt hair, the general air of someone who hadn't engaged with society in far too long. He saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the slight shift in her expression. But when she spoke, her voice was professional and kind. Yes, we were expecting you. Let me get Dr. Patterson. She's our emergency vet tonight. Just have a seat and we'll be right with you. Marcus sat in one of the plastic chairs, the dog still cradled in his arms. He was acutely aware of how out of place he looked in this bright, clean space. The other people in the waiting room, a woman with a cat in a carrier, an elderly man with a small terrier, both glanced at him with curiosity, then quickly looked away. He tried to make himself smaller, less noticeable, but it was difficult when you were holding a bleeding dog wrapped in old blankets. The wait felt both interminable and impossibly short. Time seemed to move strangely when you were anxious. Minutes stretched into hours, or hours compressed into moments. Marcus wasn't sure which was happening now. He just sat there, watching the dog's breathing, feeling the slight rise and fall of its body against his chest, and tried not to think about what would happen if the animal didn't survive. He had never considered himself a person who cared about things. He had spent the last 5 years carefully cultivating indifference, treating the world and everything in it as something that happened to other people. But this small, broken creature in his arms was making it very difficult to maintain that stance. "Mr. Chen?" Marcus looked up. A woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and kind eyes was standing in the doorway that led to the back of the clinic. She wore white scrubs and had a stethoscope draped around her neck. "I'm Dr. Patterson. Why don't you bring your dog back here, and we'll get a better look at what we're dealing with?" Marcus stood and followed her through the doorway into a brightly lit examination room. The walls were lined with medical equipment and supplies, and the room smelled even more strongly of antiseptic than the waiting room had. Dr. Patterson gestured to an examination table, and Marcus carefully laid the dog down on it, unwrapping the blankets. The vet immediately began her examination, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She palpated the injured leg, listened to the dog's heart and lungs with her stethoscope, examined the gash along its side, and checked its mouth and eyes. Throughout it all, she maintained a running commentary. "Compound fracture of the rear left leg. Deep laceration on the left flank. Looks like it could have been caused by a vehicle. Severe dehydration, malnutrition. This dog has been on the streets for a while." She looked up at Marcus. "Do you know where you found it?" "On my property," Marcus said. "Near the tree line. I live about 5 miles outside of town. I have no idea how it got there." "Any identification? Collar, microchip, anything like that?" Marcus shook his head. "I didn't see a collar. I don't know about a microchip." Dr. Patterson nodded and continued her examination. "Well, the good news is that the dog is still relatively young. I'd estimate maybe 2 or 3 years old. And aside from the injuries and malnutrition, there's no sign of serious disease or infection. The bad news is that the fracture is serious, and that gash is going to need stitches. We're also going to need to get some fluids in this dog and started on antibiotics to prevent infection." "Can you fix it?" Marcus asked. "The leg, I mean. Will it heal?" "With proper care and time, yes. Dogs are remarkably resilient. We can set the fracture and put a cast on it. The dog will need to rest for several weeks and have limited mobility, but there's no reason to think it won't make a full recovery." She paused, studying Marcus's face. "The real question is whether you're prepared to provide that level of care. It's going to require patience and commitment. You'll need to keep the dog confined so it doesn't re-injure itself. You'll need to bring it back for follow-up appointments. You'll need to monitor the cast and watch for signs of infection or complications." Marcus realized that this was a decision point. He could say no. He could tell the vet to do what she could, and then he would go back to his house and resume his life of careful isolation. The dog would be fine. Dr. Patterson had said so. It would recover. Someone else could adopt it, give it a home. He didn't have to be responsible for it. But as he looked at the dog, which was now watching him with those same intelligent eyes, he realized something. He didn't want to say no. For the first time in years, he wanted to say yes to something. He wanted to commit to something. He wanted to have a reason to keep living beyond just the automatic continuation of his own existence. "I can do it," he said. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Patterson smiled. "Good. Let's get started then. I'm going to need to keep the dog overnight for observation and to set the fracture properly. You can pick it up tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, I'll need some information from you, your name, phone number, address, and we should probably give the dog a name if you're going to be caring for it." Marcus provided his information and then paused when it came time to name the dog. He had never named anything before. He wasn't sure what the protocol was. Should it be something based on the dog's appearance, its personality, something meaningful? "What do you think?" he asked Dr. Patterson. "What would be a good name for this dog?" The vet looked at the animal thoughtfully. "Well, considering where you found it and the circumstances, I'd say something that represents resilience or survival might be appropriate." "What about Phoenix? For rising from the ashes, so to speak?" Marcus considered this. It was a bit on the nose, perhaps. But there was something fitting about it. A creature that had been broken and abandoned, brought back from the edge of death, rising again. It felt appropriate for both the dog and, if he was being honest with himself, for Marcus as well. "Phoenix," he said. "That works." As he drove home an hour later, after paying a bill that was significantly larger than he had anticipated and receiving detailed instructions on how to care for the dog, Marcus found himself thinking about what had just happened. He had made a commitment. He had taken responsibility for another living being. He had engaged with the world in a way that required him to show up and do things and be present. It was terrifying, and it was exhilarating. When he got home, the house felt different. It was still the same beige walls, the same furniture, the same carefully ordered emptiness. But now it felt like it was waiting for something, waiting for the dog to come home, waiting for life to return to it. Marcus made a pot of coffee, real coffee this time, not the cold dregs that had been sitting in his mug for hours, and sat on the porch to watch the stars. The night was clear and cold, and the stars seemed brighter than they had in years. Or perhaps he was just noticing them for the first time in a long time. Tomorrow, he would bring Phoenix home. Tomorrow, his life would change again. Not dramatically, perhaps. Not in the way that the scandal had changed it, or the divorce, or any of the other major events that had shaped his trajectory. But in a quieter way, a more fundamental way, in a way that suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth living for. The night he picked up Phoenix, he had picked up something else as well. A reason to keep going, a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to engage with the world, however small and limited that engagement might be. For the first time in 5 years, Marcus Chen felt something that might have been hope. The next afternoon arrived with an almost unbearable slowness. Marcus had spent the morning cleaning his house, something he hadn't done with any real intention in years. He vacuumed the living room, wiped down the kitchen counters, and even changed the sheets on the bed in the second bedroom, which he decided would become Phoenix's recovery room. It needed to be quiet, warm, and away from the main activity of the house. A place where the dog could rest and heal without disturbance. He had also made a trip into town to purchase supplies. Dog food. The vet had recommended a specific brand for sensitive stomachs. A bed, water, and food bowls. Toys, though he wasn't sure if Phoenix would be interested in toys given the circumstances. Cleaning supplies for inevitable accidents. A leash. Treats. The list had seemed to grow as he moved through the pet store. Each item representing a small commitment, a small acknowledgement that his life was about to become more complicated. The cashier, a young man with a nose ring and an air of casual indifference, had barely looked at him as he rang up the purchases. But Marcus had felt self-conscious nonetheless, aware that he was buying the supplies of someone who was about to take on a significant responsibility. What if he failed? What if he couldn't handle it? What if he fell back into his old patterns of isolation and neglect? But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had made a commitment. He was going to see it through. At 2 p.m., he drove back to the emergency veterinary clinic. The waiting room was busier this time. A woman with a rabbit, another with a snake in a terrarium, an elderly couple with an anxious-looking golden retriever. Marcus approached the reception desk, and the same tired-eyed woman from the previous night smiled at him in recognition. "Mr. Chen, Dr. Patterson said you'd be coming by. Let me get Phoenix for you." She disappeared into the back, and Marcus took a seat to wait. His leg bounced with nervous energy. He was about to meet Phoenix again, but this time as something more than just a creature he had found injured on his property. This time, Phoenix would be his responsibility, his dog, his companion. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. When Dr. Patterson emerged carrying Phoenix, Marcus barely recognized the animal. The blood and dirt had been cleaned away, revealing a dog with a mottled gray and brown coat, with patches of white on its chest and paws. The injured leg was encased in a white cast that went from the dog's paw up past its knee. But more than that, Phoenix looked different, calmer, more present. The pain and fear that had clouded its eyes the night before had been replaced by something else, a kind of cautious hope perhaps, or simply relief at being cared for. "Phoenix did great overnight," Dr. Patterson said, handing the dog to Marcus. "The fracture is set, the wound is stitched and bandaged, and we've got him on a good course of antibiotics. He's eaten a little bit, which is a good sign. He's still weak and in some pain, but that will improve with time and rest." She walked Marcus through a detailed list of instructions. Keep the cast dry. Watch for signs of infection around the stitches. Limited activity. Short walks only, and only on the leash. Pain medication twice a day. Follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. Diet recommendations. What to watch for. What to do if something went wrong. Marcus listened intently, committing everything to memory. He had never been responsible for another living being before. It felt monumental. "Any questions?" Dr. Patterson asked. Will he trust me?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. I found him injured. He was in pain. Will he associate me with that pain, or?" Dr. Patterson smiled gently. "Dogs are much more forgiving than humans, Mr. Chen. Phoenix will associate you with care and safety and comfort. You found him when he was suffering and brought him to help. That matters. He'll remember that." Marcus wasn't entirely sure he believed her, but he appreciated the sentiment. The drive home was slow and careful. Marcus kept one hand on Phoenix, feeling the dog's warm body next to him on the passenger seat, reassuring himself that the animal was still breathing, still alive, still there. Phoenix dozed off partway through the drive, his head resting against Marcus's leg. When they arrived at the house, Marcus carefully carried Phoenix inside and set him down in the second bedroom on the bed he had prepared. The dog looked around the room with what Marcus interpreted as curiosity, then seemed to settle, finding a comfortable position on the soft bedding. "Welcome home," Marcus said softly, and the words felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Over the next few days, a new routine began to establish itself. Marcus would wake up at 6:15 a.m., but instead of making coffee and sitting on the porch alone, he would first check on Phoenix. He would help the dog outside to relieve itself, supporting the injured leg carefully. He would administer the pain medication mixed into food. He would sit with the dog, talking to it, telling it about his day, his thoughts, his feelings, things he hadn't voiced to another living being in years. The dog seemed to listen. Whether Phoenix actually understood the words didn't matter. What mattered was that Marcus was speaking them. What mattered was that he was engaging with the world, however small that engagement might be. By the end of the first week, Phoenix was moving around the house more confidently. The cast was still in place, and the dog was still clearly in some discomfort. But the initial trauma was fading. Marcus noticed that Phoenix would follow him from room to room, unwilling to be left alone for long. In the evenings, the dog would rest its head on Marcus's lap as he sat on the porch, watching the sunset. It was a small gesture, but it felt profound. One afternoon, about 10 days after bringing Phoenix home, Marcus was sitting in the living room reading, something he hadn't done in years, when he heard a knock on the door. The sound was so unexpected, so foreign to his carefully isolated existence, that he froze for a moment. No one ever came to his house. No one knew where he lived. No one cared enough to try to find him. He opened the door cautiously. Standing on his porch was Dr. Patterson, holding a small package. Behind her, parked in his driveway, was her veterinary clinic's van. "I was in the area for a house call," she said by way of explanation, "and I thought I'd stop by to check on Phoenix, see how he's doing in his recovery." Marcus was momentarily speechless. He stepped aside to let her in, and she moved through his house with the easy confidence of someone who spent her days in other people's spaces. Phoenix, recognizing the vet, hobbled over to greet her, his tail wagging cautiously. Dr. Patterson knelt down to examine the dog, running her hands over the cast, checking the stitches, assessing Phoenix's overall condition. "He's doing remarkably well," she said. "The healing is progressing nicely. I'd say another week or so and we can think about removing the cast." "How has he been eating?" "Good," Marcus said. "Better every day. He's starting to play a little bit, though I try to discourage it so he doesn't re-injure himself. That's normal. Dogs want to be active, and it's a sign that he's feeling better." Dr. Patterson stood and looked at Marcus directly. "And how are you doing, Mr. Chen? This is a big responsibility you've taken on." Marcus considered the question. How was he doing? A month ago, he would have said he was fine, or more accurately, that he was nothing. But now, with Phoenix in his life, with a reason to get up in the morning, with another being depending on him for care and attention, he realized that the answer had changed. "I'm doing better than I have in years," he said honestly. "I didn't expect that." Dr. Patterson smiled. "Phoenix needed you, but I think, in a way, you needed Phoenix too." After she left, after examining Phoenix one more time and assuring Marcus that the dog's recovery was on track, Marcus sat on the porch with Phoenix beside him and thought about what the vet had said. It was true. He had needed this. He had needed a reason to engage with the world. He had needed to feel like he mattered to someone, even if that someone was a dog. But more than that, he was beginning to realize something else. The isolation that had seemed so necessary, so protective, had actually been slowly killing him. and Phoenix's arrival had begun to reverse that process. Not all at once, not dramatically. But gradually, day by day, moment by moment, Marcus was coming back to life. The dog looked up at him, and Marcus reached down to scratch behind Phoenix's ears. The dog's tail wagged, and Marcus found himself smiling, a genuine smile, not the grimace he had perfected over years of forced social interaction. For the first time since the scandal, since the divorce, since his complete and total fall from grace, Marcus Chen felt something that resembled happiness. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself settling into a routine that felt both foreign and comforting. He had never been one for routines. They had always seemed mundane, a sign of a life that had grown stagnant. But now, with Phoenix by his side, the predictable rhythm of daily life brought him a sense of stability he hadn't realized he craved. Every morning, he would wake up at 6:15 a.m., just as he always had. But this time, he wasn't alone. Phoenix would be waiting at the foot of the bed, tail wagging, eyes bright and expectant. Marcus would stretch and smile, feeling the warmth of the dog's presence as he slid out of bed. Their first task was always the same: a careful trip outside to let Phoenix relieve himself. The dog had learned to navigate his limitations, moving with a cautious grace that Marcus admired. After their morning outing, they would share breakfast. Marcus had taken to preparing scrambled eggs for himself, and he had begun sharing small bites with Phoenix, who devoured them with an enthusiasm that made Marcus laugh. It was a simple act, but it felt monumental. Sharing food, sharing life. With each passing day, Phoenix grew stronger. The cast was removed after 2 weeks, and the vet had approved a gradual return to normal activity. Marcus watched with pride as the dog began to experiment with his newfound freedom, tentatively exploring the house and yard, tail wagging with excitement. Phoenix was learning to trust Marcus more fully, and that trust was reciprocated. Marcus found himself speaking to the dog about everything and nothing: his thoughts, his hopes, even the lingering shadows of his past. One afternoon, while they were lounging on the porch, Marcus found himself discussing his life before Phoenix. "You know," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "I used to be someone. At least, I think I was. I had a career, a life. I thought I had everything figured out." He paused, looking out over the yard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "But I lost it all. And for a long time, I thought I would never recover." Phoenix looked up at him, as if he understood every word. His eyes were full of an unwavering loyalty that made Marcus's heart swell. "But you showed up when I needed you the most. You gave me a reason to care again." The dog wagged his tail and rested his head on Marcus's knee, and in that moment, Marcus felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. One afternoon, while Marcus was cleaning up after lunch, his phone rang unexpectedly. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said cautiously. "Marcus, it's Sarah." His heart raced. Sarah, his ex-wife. The name echoed in his mind, stirring up a whirlwind of emotions, some painful, others nostalgic. He hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, hadn't heard her voice in years. "Sarah," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It's been a while." "Yes, it has," she said, her voice softer than he remembered. "I've been thinking about you, about us. I wanted to see how you're doing." Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I'm okay. I'm getting by." "Just okay?" she asked, a hint of concern creeping into her voice. "I heard about the dog. I saw it on social media." "Phoenix," he corrected gently. "His name is Phoenix." "That's a good name," she said, and there was a pause on the line. "I'm glad you're taking care of him. It sounds like you're finding your way back." The conversation felt surreal. They spoke for a while, catching up on the mundane details of life. Sarah had moved to a new city for work, and she had started a small graphic design business. She asked about Marcus's life, and he found himself sharing more than he expected about his days with Phoenix, about the changes he was slowly making in his life. "I'm trying to be better," he admitted, feeling a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to express in years. "That's good to hear. You deserve to be happy, Marcus," she said, a note of sincerity in her voice. The conversation ended with tentative plans to meet for coffee, an idea that both excited and terrified him. Would it feel awkward? Would they simply rehash the past? Or could they find a way to navigate a new relationship? A few days later, Marcus found himself standing outside a small cafe in town, anxiously checking his watch. He had chosen a spot that was familiar, a place they used to visit together when things had been good between them. But now, it felt like a different world. The air was thick with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When Sarah arrived, she looked different. Older, perhaps, but more vibrant. The way she carried herself had changed. She seemed more confident, more at ease in her own skin. They exchanged awkward smiles and a hesitant hug, and Marcus felt a rush of memories flood back. Good ones, bad ones, the entire spectrum of their shared history. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her eyes searching his. "Of course," he replied, motioning for her to sit. "It's been a long time." They talked about everything, the good, the bad, the in-between. Sarah shared stories from her new life, and Marcus filled her in on Phoenix's recovery and how the dog had changed his perspective. With every passing moment, the walls that had built up between them began to crumble, brick by brick. "Marcus," she said, her tone shifting, "I know things ended badly. But I want you to know that I never stopped caring about you. I just didn't know how to help you back then." "I didn't know how to help myself," he admitted, the honesty feeling liberating. "I was so caught up in my own shame and failure that I pushed everyone away. I pushed you away." Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. "I wish I could have done more. But I think we both needed to go through our own journeys. I'm proud of you for taking this step." As they spoke, it became clear that their shared history didn't need to be a burden. Instead, it could be a foundation for something new. They both had grown, evolved, and there was a possibility of rebuilding a connection that had once seemed irreparably broken. After that meeting, Marcus and Sarah began to spend more time together. Their relationship was tentative at first, marked by careful conversations and shared laughter. They would go for walks, visit the dog park with Phoenix, and talk about their lives over coffee. It felt like rediscovering a long-lost friend, but also like opening a door to something that could become deeper. Marcus felt a warmth growing inside him, a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. He was no longer just a man who had lost everything. He was someone who was rebuilding, someone who was learning to care again, not just for a dog, but for himself and for others. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Marcus and Phoenix deepened. The dog had become more than just a companion. He was a catalyst for change. He had brought Marcus back to life, to the present, and Marcus found himself embracing the unpredictability of it all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the world in golden light, Marcus sat on the porch with Phoenix curled up at his feet. Sarah was joining them for dinner, and he felt a sense of excitement and nervousness. The porch felt like a threshold, a place where he could reflect on where he had been and where he was headed. "Tomorrow," he whispered to Phoenix. "We'll go for a longer walk. We can explore the trails behind the house. I think you're ready for it." The dog lifted his head, tail thumping against the porch floor in agreement. In that moment, Marcus realized how far he had come. He was no longer just a man in a house waiting for time to pass. He was a man with a purpose, a man with connections, a man who was willing to take risks again. And for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as Marcus walked Phoenix through the trails behind his property. 3 months had passed since he had found the dog, and the transformation in both of them was remarkable. Phoenix moved with confidence now, his injured leg fully healed, his coat shining with health and vitality. Marcus, too, had changed, his posture straighter, his eyes brighter, his entire demeanor shifted from one of resigned isolation to cautious engagement with the world. But not everything was moving forward smoothly. That morning, Marcus had received an email that had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It was from a journalist at a major news outlet, someone who had apparently been investigating his past, the scandal that had driven him into exile 5 years ago. The email was brief but ominous. "I'm working on a piece about corporate malfeasance in the financial sector. Your name has come up repeatedly. I'd like to hear your side of the story before publication." Marcus had read the email 3 times, each time feeling his chest tighten with a familiar dread. He had spent 5 years trying to bury that part of his life, trying to pretend it didn't exist. But apparently, the past had other plans. "Come on, boy," he said to Phoenix, tugging gently on the leash. "Let's head back." That evening, Marcus sat in his study, a room he rarely used, filled with books and papers from his former life, and pulled out the old boxes he had stored in the closet. Inside were documents, emails, financial records, all the detritus of his professional life before the fall. He hadn't looked at these materials in years, had actively avoided them. But now he forced himself to confront them. The scandal had been complex and, in many ways, not entirely his fault. Marcus had been a senior analyst at a major investment firm, and he had discovered irregularities in how certain funds were being managed. He had raised concerns internally, but his warnings had been dismissed or buried. When the situation eventually came to light publicly, Marcus had been caught in the crossfire, blamed by some for not speaking up sooner, blamed by others for being complicit in the wrongdoing. The truth was somewhere in the middle, as it usually was. He hadn't been the architect of the fraud, but he also hadn't done enough to stop it. That was the guilt that had driven him into isolation. Not the guilt of a criminal, but the guilt of someone who had failed to act decisively when it mattered most. When Sarah arrived for dinner that evening, she found Marcus sitting in the study, surrounded by papers and looking haunted. "Marcus, what's going on?" she asked, concern etched on her face. He looked up at her, and in that moment, he made a decision. He was tired of carrying this alone. He was tired of hiding. And if he was going to move forward with Sarah, if he was going to rebuild his life, she deserved to know the full truth. "Sit down," he said. "I need to tell you about what happened. The real story." For the next hour, Marcus laid bare the details of his past. He explained the financial irregularities, his attempts to report them, his failure to pursue the matter more aggressively, and the eventual public scandal that had destroyed his career and his marriage. He talked about the shame, the guilt, the self-recrimination that had driven him into 5 years of self-imposed exile. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to understanding, to something that looked like compassion. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked softly. "Because I was ashamed," Marcus admitted. "I thought if I didn't talk about it, if I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would go away. Maybe I could pretend to be someone else, someone better." "But you can't pretend forever," Sarah said. "And you don't have to be someone else, Marcus. You just have to be honest about who you are, the good and the bad." "There's more," Marcus said. And he told her about the journalist's email. "They're going to dig this up again. It's going to be in the news. People are going to know where I am, what I've been doing." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "So let them know. But tell your story first. Don't let someone else define your narrative." The next morning, Marcus made a decision. Instead of waiting for the journalist's article to come out, instead of letting his past be weaponized by someone else's investigation, he would tell his own story. He would reach out to the journalist and agree to an interview, but on his terms. He spent the day preparing, organizing his thoughts, deciding what he wanted to say. Phoenix stayed by his side throughout, a comforting presence as Marcus confronted the demons he had been running from for so long. The interview took place over video call 2 days later. The journalist, a woman named Chen, no relation, was professional and thorough. She asked difficult questions, but she also listened, really listened, to Marcus's answers. He told her about his concerns regarding the fund management, about his attempts to report the irregularities, about his failure to pursue the matter more aggressively, and the guilt that had haunted him for years. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rebecca asked. "Why break your silence after 5 years?" "Because I'm tired of running," Marcus said simply. "Because I've realized that the only way to move forward is to face what happened and accept my role in it. I wasn't the villain in this story, but I wasn't the hero either. I was someone who saw something wrong and didn't do enough to stop it. And I've spent 5 years punishing myself for that. But punishment doesn't change anything. Only action does." Rebecca nodded, making notes. "What have you been doing these past 5 years?" Marcus found himself talking about Phoenix, about how the dog had changed his life, about the slow process of rebuilding. He talked about reconnecting with Sarah, about learning to engage with the world again, about the possibility of redemption. "That's an interesting angle," Rebecca said. "The story isn't just about corporate malfeasance. It's about what happens to someone after they fall, how they survive it, how they rebuild." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "That's the story I want to tell." The article came out 2 weeks later, and it was not what Marcus had feared. Rebecca had written a nuanced, thoughtful piece that examined the systemic failures in the financial industry, Marcus's role in those failures, and his subsequent attempt to rebuild his life. She didn't excuse his inaction, but she contextualized it within the larger framework of institutional pressure and the difficulty of speaking truth to power. The article was titled, "The Road Back: One Man's Journey from Corporate Scandal to Redemption." The response was mixed, as Marcus had expected. Some people praised his honesty and his attempt at redemption. Others remained skeptical, viewing his story as an attempt to rehabilitate his image. But what surprised Marcus was how little it mattered. The opinions of strangers, the judgments of people who didn't know him, seemed to carry far less weight than they once had. What mattered was what Phoenix thought. What mattered was what Sarah thought. What mattered was what Marcus thought of himself. In the weeks following the article's publication, life settled into a new rhythm. Marcus received a few interview requests and speaking opportunities. but he turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in becoming a public figure or a poster child for redemption. He was simply interested in living a quiet life and continuing to rebuild what had been broken. One evening, as he and Sarah sat on the porch with Phoenix between them, Sarah turned to Marcus and said, "I'm proud of you." "For what?" he asked. "For facing your past, for being honest, for allowing yourself to be vulnerable." She paused, then added, "For letting people help you." Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without Phoenix. Without the choice to try." Phoenix, hearing his name, lifted his head and wagged his tail, as if in agreement. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Marcus felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He wasn't the man he used to be, the ambitious, driven analyst who had thought he had everything figured out. But he was becoming someone better, someone who understood failure, who had learned to forgive himself, who recognized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to move forward despite it. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. And he wouldn't be facing it alone.